Hi everyone, how you doing? This is nice and cozy. Look at all this space they gave us. This is great. So you at the end, if you might want to move in a little bit. So I'm going to be pointing at this screen if it works. I don't know how good the view will be if you're over there. Has this been happening up until now? Okay, we're back. All right. So, have you had a good conference? Have you been here for the whole week, workshops and a conference, or yeah, no, just a couple of you. So, yeah, it's been a long week, but it's been really good. NDC always do a really solid job. It's always a really nice conference. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Adam. I come from the UK originally, and I now live in Switzerland, and I work for a company called Particular Software. I don't know if they have this problem about in the US, they always get Sweden and Switzerland mixed up. I don't know if that happens here or not, but I was in a taxi once in Dallas, and I said to the guy, I'm from Switzerland, spend a bit of time in Zurich, and about 1 minute later he said to me, so is Zurich the capital of Sweden? So it really does happen, but I'm sure all of you know the difference, and likewise I know all about Australia, because I used to live here. I used to live here from 96 to 97. So these grey bits on my beard are for a reason. I'm showing my age a bit there.
Probably more of an American thing.
Yeah. Well, I know all about Australia. Ask me anything about the Swans down in Melbourne or the Magpies up here in Sydney, or two of my favourite rugby teams. And yeah, I like watching the Sheffield Shield, but when I'm not doing that, I like to write software, and I like to write open source software. And I'm going to tell you about something that happened back in 2014. Microsoft used to run an event called Connect, and in November 2014, they announced something really exciting. I was watching this at work. I had it on one of my screens at work, and I was watching it out of one eye. And one thing specifically really caught my eye, and that was this. They open sourced the .NET Core framework at Connect in 2014. And I thought this is absolutely fantastic, because I can now clone it, I can run it on my machine, I can build it, I can change code, I can do all the stuff I can do with any open source project. So I did that, I cloned it, and in the root folder I saw a build.cmd. So I thought, well, that's begging to be run. So I ran it, and a load of green text flashed past, which was really good. And right at the end, this happened, right? A bunch of red text, and that's never a good sign. So I thought, well, surely this can't not build. They've just announced it to millions of developers. This has to work. It must be me. Right? So I had a look at there were a couple of tests failing, and they're around these two objects. There's a vector 2 and a vector 3, and it was expecting US dollars, and it was actually getting CHF. So CHF is the currency symbol for Swiss francs. It's the ISO currency symbol for that. And same with vector 3. So I'm there sitting in Switzerland on my Swiss-German machine, and obviously they'd never run this code outside Redmond before, or at least outside the US, because they were expecting that the local machine has a US culture. So I had a look at the test, and sure enough, you see up here they're saying culture info in US and expecting dollars. Here they're not specifying a culture, so it's going to use the culture of the machine, which in my case is Swiss francs. It's not going to be dollars. And exactly the same in vector 3. Vector 4 actually passed. Can you see why? I know it's a bit small, maybe. Anyone spot it? Testing the wrong variable, yes. You see, they're testing v1 still formatted here. It should be v2. They're testing the variable from up here instead. It's the wrong variable. So a flawed test, but it passes just because it is flawed. So anyway, I thought I'd fix vector 2 and vector 3. So the fix was very simple. I just said, take each item in the collection, in the vector, format it by its local currency symbol, not specifying a culture, and that will come out as, and that will be the expected format for the culture of my machine in CHF. So that fixed the test. I did the same for vector 3. Anyone who does know me knows that I'm a white space aficionado. And fellow connoisseurs will notice that I actually inserted a blank line here when I made this change. So I actually found that out when I was putting this slide together, to my horror. But there it is. It's there in history. I can't change it now. But I did that because I got really excited. I thought this might be the first ever PR to the .NET Core framework. So I tweeted and I said, look, I sent the PR and I said, look, I've just sent what I think is the first ever PR to the .NET Core framework. And this very quickly went viral. So this is actually the PR itself. And I can actually quickly switch to this and show you it. It's right here. So it did get merged, but people quickly picked up on this, and all kinds of people started chiming in. And is that officially the first community pull request? Blah blah blah. You know, and it got really exciting, and it did get merged. Right, .NET Bot merged it, of all people. I presume someone invoked that. It wasn't just done automatically. But yeah, all kinds of people kept chiming in here, and you know, it got very exciting, and all kinds of GIFs and things started popping up, and yeah, there's Phil Hack waving his arms, and I won't go through the whole thing because it's very, very long, but go and look it up. It's actually pretty cool. Yeah, so that did get merged, and that was all very cool. But so we kept on watching the event, and later on, Scott Hansen was giving an interview on Channel 9, and he revealed that they actually had this kind of plan. They had this already kind of stage managed and ready to go. So Scott Hanselman was going to get on stage with Miguel de Casa, who's the guy basically behind Mono and Xamarin and that kind of stuff. And Miguel was going to send the first ever PR to the .NET framework, and Scott Hanselman was going to merge it live on stage. So I completely ruined that plan. And I think this is the actual moment when they pulled up the, sorry about the resolution. This is a scrape from a tweet. I can't find any better resolution. But they pulled up the web page and they were all ready to go. And it says here, Adam Ralph committed an hour ago. Just look at Miguel's face. Every time I've done this talk a couple of times, I always try and publicly apologize to these guys. So, you know, sorry for ruining your plans. I'll do it again. You know, sorry guys if you happen to watch this video. But in the end, Scott actually had the last laugh, because I don't know if you noticed, I sent this PR saying, this fixes the following test failure on my DECH machine, where DECH means Swiss German. And Scott was telling the interviewer about this funny story and how it all happened. He said, well, a few minutes after we made the announcement, this guy from the community, Adam Ralph, came along and sent the PR and someone merged it. I think he's from Czechoslovakia. And from that moment, I became known as that Czechoslovakian guy, the guy that sent that PR. And this has actually persisted. I even have a friend who still calls me the Czechoslovakian guy. He won't let it lie. So yeah, I think, Scott, maybe you got the last laugh. Or did you? Because Czechoslovakia doesn't even begin with CH. And it's not even a country. It's a remnant from the Cold War. So yeah, maybe you didn't have the last laugh after all. Okay, let's step back a little bit and think about open source more generally. So I'm going to talk about open source from three different angles. So I'm going to talk about it from the point of view of the community, because ultimately that's what open source is. Open source is the community, and it's quite interesting to see how that's evolved over time. I'm going to talk about Microsoft. This is not going to be a talk about Microsoft, but I think Microsoft's journey through open source and its relationship with open source is a really, really compelling tale of how powerful the influence of open source is, and the relationship that's built up between open source and the big corporation. Then I'm going to talk about me, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the journey that I've had through open source and the things that have happened to me and the things that I've managed to get out of it. So we can trace the history of open source right back to the 60s. I'm sure most of you have heard of MIT, and more specifically within MIT, there were a couple of organizations called the Tech Model Railroad Club and the AI Lab. And it wasn't just MIT, it was places like Carnegie Mellon, Stanford University, and people all around these universities, they got these new shiny computer things and they just played with them. They experimented with them. They tried to see what they could make them do and tried to see what wacky directions they could take them in and what crazy stuff they could do with them. And they used to use these things a lot. Has anyone ever seen one of these, a PDP-10? This is a very famous mainframe from this era. I've seen one. My dad used to use one at work, although I think it might have been the PDP-11, I'm not sure. But the guys at the AI lab at MIT were not, they took delivery of this really nice thing, but they weren't really happy with the OS that came with it, so they just wrote their own one. They called it the incompatible time-sharing system. It's actually a very interesting story in itself. And they put this incompatible time-sharing system on it. They hooked it up to the ARPANET, which was kind of the precursor to the internet. And from there, this kind of hacker subculture started to coalesce, and they started to talk to each other. And in 1975, the word hacker had its first kind of definition. So there is a thing called the jargon file, which still exists to this day. And this is kind of a glossary of words and terms that these guys use for the things that they do with computers. And a guy called Raphael Finkel entered the word hacker into the jargon file in 1975. And he said, a hacker is a person who enjoys exploring the details of programmable systems and how to stretch their capabilities, as opposed to most users who prefer to learn only the minimum necessary. So try and remember those words, because I'm going to call back to them a little bit as we go along. And incidentally, this was the year that Microsoft was born, 1975. Right, if you fast forward to 1983, this is where I enter this scenario, and this is not when I was born. I'm unfortunately a lot older than that. This is when I got my first computer. Does anyone recognize this? Wow, I see a nodding head. Are you originally from Australia? Wow. Okay, you're just an enthusiast. Oh, that's good to hear. Your dad had one. Really, one of these? Awesome. So this was a computer by Acorn Computers. Acorn Computers and the BBC got together in the UK and started a program for schools. They wanted to put a computer in every single school. So they had this much bigger machine called the BBC Micro, which was kind of about this big. And this was kind of the cheaper mass consumer version of it. So this is the one that I got at home in 1983. The best thing about this thing is it had a really, really good basic, because it got the basic from the BBC Micro, which was designed for schools, designed for teaching. And that meant that I used to spend a lot of my time writing this kind of stuff. You could play games from tapes in these days, and that's how we played most commercial games, or you could get a magazine or a book and just type out games and then play them. And I used to be able to type this out in about a minute flat. It was one of my party tricks. So we weren't allowed to put computer games on our school computers. If you got caught with a game cassette, you'd get it confiscated. So at the beginning of lunchtime, we'd huddle around the computer. I'd type this out in about a minute flat, and we'd play it for an hour. So that was really good. Got me a lot of friends. Can anyone see, I guess it's a bit small for you at the back, but can anyone see what kind of game this is? I saw this. Yeah, it's something. The clue is in the variable names. There's things like road and car. So it's a car game. It's a racing game. And I actually recreated this from scratch for this talk, and it took me about half a day. I just couldn't remember any of the syntax, but I got there in the end. So I can actually take this computer game, and I can switch to a BBC emulator. And I can paste that code in, and fingers crossed, I can hit run, and there we go, hey presto. Right, so, and I tell you what, this game looks really dumb, but it's actually quite addictive. I think I wasted about another half a day just playing this after I wrote it, and it does get more difficult as you go along. So these red things get a bit more frequent, and the road gets a little bit more windy. I was about to say I normally get over 500. So tempted to have another go. Shall I? No. Or is this a temptation? I've never got to 1,000. Right, that is my. I've never ever got to 1,000, but I'll keep trying. So, believe it or not, that's not the only thing that was going on in the world of computing in 1983. Does anyone recognize this guy? Anyone? It's a guy called Richard Stallman. And Richard Stallman, he looks a bit different now, but Richard Stallman was or is a very vocal proponent of free software. Not free as in beer, but free as in freedom. So he wants software to be freed, for it to be open, for for modification by anyone. He hates companies hiding software. And this was the period of the original proprietary Unix wars. So there was a lot of big companies having their own Unix distributions and fighting for domination in the market. And Richard hated this because they were all kind of, well, I guess you could call it closed source. They weren't open, the code wasn't free. You couldn't see the source code. So he had this dream of a free, open Unix OS built by the community, and he called it GNU. So GNU is actually a recursive algorithm. It stands for GNU's not Unix. So really, really great idea. And the GNU project went to work on this, but if we fast forward to 1991, it still hadn't happened. So a lot of good stuff had happened in the meantime. They'd released Emacs and all kinds of other stuff, but the dream of a free operating system had never actually materialized. But in 1991, something else came along. Does anyone recognize this guy? Linus, exactly. They're getting easier now. So Linus invented in 1991 something called Linux, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Now, the amazing thing about Linux was that Linus had the idea for Linux in 1991. He posted the first version of the code on a bulletin board in 1991 and released the first version in 1991. So from inception to fruition within the space of a year. But why hadn't that happened with the GNU project? Why hadn't they released their free operating system within that length of time? Well, in 1997, we got our first kind of like attempt at explaining what that fundamental difference was. Why did Linux happen so quickly? Does anyone recognize this guy? It's gone back to be a bit more difficult again. This is a guy called Eric S. Raymond. And Eric S. Raymond wrote in 1997 an essay named The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And in that, he described two different methods of development, of software development. The cathedral is where, yes, the code is open and available and anyone can see it and people can modify it. But between releases, between phases of that software being released, it was really only kind of a smaller group of developers who collaborated on it and worked together on it very, very closely. Then there's the bazaar, where everything's kind of a bit more wild and out in the open, it's all open discussion and open conversation and open decisions. Everything's kind of done publicly. This was more how the GNU project was being run, and this would describe much more how Linus had run the Linux project. And he actually said that Linus's greatest invention was not actually Linux itself, it was a development methodology. It was a development methodology that made Linux great and is now continuing to make lots of other software great. This was the beginning of the open source methodology of software. There's more around the bazaar model. This is actually a book now. The essay has been made into a book. You can buy it on Amazon. I thoroughly recommend it. It's really, really fascinating to read about the history of this stuff. Okay, 97 continue. What else is going on in 97? Well, this is when I got my first job. I actually finished university a little bit earlier, did some odds and ends, but then I got my kind of first job in a big company, in a bank, right here in Sydney. So my friend of mine and me and a friend of mine, we decided to do a 2-year round-the-world trip with a year in Australia in between. I got here at the end of 96, beginning of 97, I got a job, not far from here, just over Clarence Street, Margaret Street Way. And it was a horrifically boring job. I had to basically take 2 sets of numbers and make sure that they were the same. That's essentially what it boiled down to. And if something was different, I had to tell my boss or send an email to someone, I can't remember. And this was incredibly boring. And one day I'd kind of done my number matching for the day, and I thought, right, what can I do now? And I was playing around in Excel and stuff like that. And I found this button called Record Macro. And I hadn't done programming for a while. I actually went to university, did maths, so I left programming behind for a few years. But I pressed this button and nothing really happened. So I just carried on doing my stuff. And then I noticed it was still recording. So I said, okay, let's get rid of that thing, let's press stop. And then boom, all this stuff appeared on my screen. And it kind of looked a bit familiar. So it had lots of dots and things in it and brackets where I wouldn't expect them. But I'd seen this stuff before. I thought, this is code, right? I've seen this before. It looks a little bit like BASIC, but of course it was VBA. And I thought, right, I'm going to put this to use. And I spent the next couple of days basically automating my job. And I got it down to the point where I could come in, press a button, and sit back. It would take about 10, 15 minutes to run, and my job was done. And this was pretty awesome. I had about a month of basically just coming to work and just pressing a button and kicking back. But then the boredom set in. I thought, I can't carry on like this. I want to work here for the next 6 months and save up to go traveling again. So I told someone, I said, look, I've automated my job. I've spent the last month automating it, even though it took me 2 days. I said, right, great. So automate some other stuff for us. And I spent the next 6 months just automating a whole load of other stuff and just writing all kinds of crazy VBA. And I think I got into Access as well and all kinds of other stuff. So I'm going to start drawing this graph now. Now this is a graph of the cumulative users of my code. So the number of people running my code, right? And as you can see that in the 80s, it was me, my brother, and a couple of friends. You know, let's just say 5 for want of a better number. And then when I started automating this stuff, 2, 3 people started running my code at work, right? And this is the new stuff that I automated here. So all in all, 8 people in history had run my code. So that's not too interesting right now, but I'll come back to it in a bit. 1998 was a very big year for open source. In 1998, who remembers Netscape Navigator? A few of you. So it was the nuts back in the day, right? It was the thing. It was awesome, right? And then IE started to come along, and IE was a bit of a joke, but then IE4 actually got fairly good, and it started to become a realistic competitor to Netscape. And Netscape were thinking, well, you know, what are we going to do here? We're in trouble, right? IE4 is like gaining a lot of ground. They read The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric S. Raymond. They thought that could be a good idea when they saw what had happened with Linux and how effective that was. They decided to make Netscape Navigator open source. The flagship product of the company, and eventually that actually became Mozilla Firefox. In reaction to that, a bunch of people, including Eric S. Raymond and a bunch of others, actually got together and defined open source. So this was the year that the term open source was coined, and it got a very long-winded definition, which I won't go into, but it basically described the method of development that Linus invented with Linux. Do everything in the open, in the public, where anyone has a chance to contribute. This is also the year where this thing happened. Has anyone heard of the Halloween documents? It sounds spooky and scary, but it's not. They're not named because they are. Although actually, when you read them, they are a little bit. This was a bunch of emails and memos that went around Microsoft between very high-level executives, and Eric S. Raymond again actually got hold of these things, and he made them public on Halloween in 1998. Hence the Halloween documents. Now, there's a lot to them, right? It's a lot of documents, but they really do make for quite amazing reading. And I'm going to read you just one excerpt verbatim because it's really quite amazing stuff. OSS projects have been able to gain a foothold in many server applications because of the wide utility of simple and highly commoditized protocols, right? That sounds great, doesn't it? By extending these protocols and developing new protocols, we can deny OSS projects entry into the market. So think about what's being said. These are high-level execs at Microsoft, right? They're actually saying, things are great right now. We've got simple and highly commoditized protocols. Let's make them complex and specialized and owned and not commoditized. You know, to me, it's a very underhand strategy. It's not saying, oh, look, there's this stuff in the market doing really well. Let's be better, right? Let's use that positive competition and let's be better. No, it's sabotage. You're sabotaging those things and trying to deny them entry into the market by doing something that's ultimately going to harm everyone, by making simple things complex and by making commoditized things specialized and owned. So it's really quite incredible stuff. Now, think about that when we start to go on and look at some of the other stuff that's happening now, and we'll relate this back to what was happening in the Halloween documents about Microsoft was basically saying that OSS is the enemy, we want to kill it. Does anyone work for Microsoft here? No? No? Okay, good. All right. Used to. Okay. Well, you've got out now. Anyway, I'm dragging their skeletons out of the cupboard, but you know this is 20 years ago, right? I'm going to say much. It was about that time. Oh, no wonder you got out. Yeah. Well, I'm going to say much nicer stuff about Microsoft now. This was 20 years ago. Yeah. Okay. 1999, I actually became a software developer in 99. So we left Sydney, we finished our travels, went back home, and I got a job in London as an actual software developer. Not just kind of automating stuff on the side, but employed to come in and write line of business software. And that meant I could use really exciting things like VB6 and ASP, not ASP.NET, ASP, yes, or classic ASP, as it sometimes. There was nothing classic about it at all, but it was really good at the time. It was really good. I really enjoyed it. And Sybase, which went on to become the foundation for SQL Server and lots of other stuff. Now, that had a bit of an impact on this graph. Again, so this is number of users of my code. It was a global system rolled out to a global department with a few hundred users. So all of a sudden from, I don't know, maybe 10 users or a few tens of users, it went up to the hundreds. The actual numbers aren't important, but it's gone from the sort of tens to the hundreds of users of my code. In 2002, Microsoft did something really interesting. They released something quite interesting. Anyone know what that was? .NET 1.0, exactly, which came also with .NET Passport and .NET Messenger and all this weird stuff. They didn't really know what .NET was back then. In the end, they actually wound that back, and it just became the .NET framework and the .NET runtime. And NUnit had the first ever contribution, had the first ever commit in 2002. Right, the same year that .NET was released, the first ever commit was made to NUnit as an open source framework. That amazed me when I found that out. I thought this stuff started way later, and I didn't know about it until way later. But yeah, when you look at it, NUnit started the same year as .NET was released. Quite amazing. Now, in 2006, in the last 8 years, Microsoft had done a lot of thinking. Right? They'd done a lot of thinking about open source, and they'd realized that open source, it's actually not going to go away. They started to think about how they're actually going to coexist with open source, and how can we not try and kill it, but actually try and ultimately help it to make us some more money. So how can we coexist with it in the market? And they appointed this guy, Sam Ramji. They employed this guy, and they appointed him as the head of open source strategy. So the strategy used to be just to kill it, right? But that wasn't his job. His job was actually to promote it and to try and use it and coexist with it. One of the first things he did was he created Codeplex. So it's gone now, but back then, 2006, they were giving the community somewhere to host their open source projects, you know, as a precursor to things like GitHub. In 2008, this is the year that I first used OSS. Right, so I actually had a break in 2008. I had almost a year between two jobs, and I started to hack again. I started to play around with .NET. I started to stretch its capabilities. Not happy just to learn the minimum necessary. I rediscovered my love of hacking, and I started to reach out for OSS libraries because I was reading a lot about the great things that they could do. And in 2011, Microsoft does OSS. So this was the first year that Microsoft actually sent an official contribution to an open source project as a company. They sent a change to Samba, right? So Samba's the Unix thing for exposing Unix file shares as Windows shares on a Windows network. And they sent a patch to Samba to fix something or add something as a company for the first time. So they're actually contributing back to OSS now for the first time. In 2012, this is when I did OSS. This is when I not just used open source, but when I actually contributed back to open source. I sent a few pull requests for a few projects, fixing up some small things. I also launched my own project called xbehave.net, which is an extension to XUnit. And that was based on a sample that Brad Wilson put together, the founder of XUnit, with a guy called Phil Hack, who used to work for Microsoft, now works for GitHub, so I guess he works for Microsoft again. And I wasn't happy just to learn the minimum necessary. I explored what I could do with that thing, and I ended up putting it into an actual package, and it's been quite a successful package since then. And has anyone heard of Fake It Easy? Mocking framework, I see quite a few nodding heads. Fake It Easy is a mocking framework. In 2012, the original founder, a guy called Patrick Hain from Sweden, he discovered that he just didn't really have enough time for the project anymore, but he still had a lot of love for it. He still loved the project. So he tweeted and said, I really love Fake It Easy. I've got no more time for it. Can anyone help me out? And I thought, well, there's no way I'm qualified to do this. There's no way he'll pick me, but what have I actually got to lose? So I actually put up my hand, I tweeted back and said, sure, I'll give it a go. And he had a look and he said, you seem like an okay guy, it's yours. Just that, and all of a sudden, I was now looking after Fake It Easy. I was the maintainer of Fake It Easy, which was very exciting for me. I spent a number of years on that project. I actually left it this year because I'm concentrating on other things. But I had a really, really good time looking after Fake It Easy for a number of years. Now, that had quite an impact on this graph. So this is the graph before 2012. So you can see here that I've got this flat bit here. Then I got my job, my proper software development job. And then it kind of didn't really, it increased slowly, but really the system I was working on never went beyond a few hundred users around the company. Now, your experience may be very different to that. You might have thousands of users, tens of thousands. You might be working on an e-commerce site which has millions. But in my case, it was an in-house line of business application with a few hundred users. Now, when we go to 2012, the graph looks like this. And that's because Fake It Easy has in the region of tens of thousands of users. So this stuff back here is this stuff down here. It's so close to zero in comparison that it's almost on zero. Now, we're yet to discover what this graph means. We'll keep exploring it and finding out. But I think it's quite interesting that just that sheer dumb metric of how many people are running my code went suddenly into the tens of thousands. Now, 2014, a lot of good stuff happened in 2014. Satya Nadella took over as a CEO of Microsoft, and does anyone remember this? Microsoft loves Linux. This is the CEO of Microsoft standing up on stage, on a publicly broadcasted event, saying Microsoft loves Linux, right? This guy down here is saying the turnaround is complete, and I think he's not far off the truth with that. And of course, he can say that, right? Halloween documents, before my time, So yeah, he's got that excuse. But yeah, he is in charge of a very, very different Microsoft, that Microsoft of '98 that produced those rather scary documents. In 2014, we got .NET Core, so .NET on Mac and Linux, right? .NET Core was made OSS. The .NET framework was announced to be open source, only for some idiot from Czechoslovakia to ruin their wonderful stage-managed production. Roslyn OSS, so C# and VB.NET are OSS. You can fix things in the language. You can add features to the language by sending pull requests. That's pretty cool. You can become an MVP, a Microsoft MVP, just via contributing to open source. So they're actually rewarding you for it now. So just keep contrasting this back to that company of old. It's really a complete turnaround in the attitude. This is the year that I joined the ScriptCS team. Anyone heard of ScriptCS? This is a project to allow C# scripting. It was quite exciting for a while. It's kind of been, things have kind of moved on since then. But here, I sent a few PRs to it, and Glenn Block and a few other guys that looked after the project just invited me to join the team, and I jumped on that chance. That was really exciting. This is the year that I contributed to NuGet. I guess, who here is a .NET developer? That's most of you. So I suspect you've all installed a NuGet package at some time. So I don't know if you're familiar with the development dependency feature in NuGet. This means that when you install a package, it's marked as a development dependency. So when you create a package, that package is not a dependency. It's just a development time dependency. So I contributed that feature. And I actually found myself on a Skype call with the entire NuGet team in Redmond. So it was them around a big conference table in Redmond, in the Microsoft campus, and me sitting at home in my office on a Skype call with them, selling this new feature to them. And then in the end, they kind of said, yeah, great, can you implement it? And I didn't expect that either. I was just trying to get them to do it. So I thought, well, okay, I'll give it a go. So I went off for a couple of days, implemented the feature, and it's still there. So now, these days, it's morphed into the private assets thing that you see in the CS proj. But ultimately, whenever you install a NuGet package, you're running some of my code, or at least a derivative of some of my code. That's had quite an impact on this graph again. I don't know if you can see this, but this is somewhere. There's about 10 million .NET developers in the world, estimated by number of Visual Studio downloads and things like that. So even if only half of them are running my code when they're installing NuGet packages, that's probably quite pessimistic as an estimate. But the point is, again, numbers not important, but there are now millions of people running my code. There are millions of people running my code just because I contributed a feature to NuGet. Now, in 2015, we got more great OSS stuff from Microsoft. The core CLR itself went open source. So it's the actual runtime for .NET Core. MS Build, WCF, all the old friends are joining in the fun now. Whether you love them or hate them, it's probably better to have them open source than not open source. And let's face it, MS Build, it's actually getting a lot better now, right? The new tiny CS proj, it's pretty nice, right? So great things are happening there, and it's all open source, which is really cool. Windows open source? That sounds far-fetched. But in 2015, a senior guy at Microsoft called Mark Russinovich said, one day there might be an open source Windows. Now, I'm skeptical, right? But you never know. Now, the fact that that is actually going through the mind of a senior exec at Microsoft, and for him to actually say it publicly is quite incredible. Back in '98, you wouldn't even be allowed to think that. The thought police would be on you in no time. But this is a senior exec actually speculating that maybe there'll be an open source Windows one day. So, like I say, I'm skeptical, but yeah, who knows? So by the time 2015 rolled around, I was maintaining several OSS projects. I got more involved in some other projects. I spoke at my first ever conferences. .NET Fringe was the first one, and there was NDC, that was in Oslo, I think, and then a few in Poland, .NET Unboxed in Dallas. I became an MVP, and I got a job at Particular Software. Now, the reason I'm calling all of this out is because open source was my gateway into all of this. So it was because I contributed to open source that I became a maintainer of several projects. It was because of open source that I started speaking at conferences directly. I got invited to my first conference, .NET Fringe, through Glenn Block, who was my fellow member of the Script CS team. He invited me to come and speak. And then at NDC, which was my second one, I gave a very, very early version of this talk back in 2015. So it was directly through my open source involvement that I got into that. I only got an MVP because of open source. I got my MVP before I'd done a single talk and before I'd done a single blog post. It was all just because I'd done a lot of open source contribution and someone nominated me as a reaction to that. And Particular Software is an open source company. We are the people behind N-Service Bus and products around that. And they're all open source, so now every day is an open source day. And the reason I got that job was because through Fake It Easy, I got to know someone. I then got to meet them in person at a .NET user group. I became friends with them, and then he said, I'm going for this cool new job, why don't you apply? And I did, and I got the job. Again, it was open source that actually opened that door for me. Without open source, I don't think any of this would have happened, or certainly not in the same way. 2016, so 2016 was an interesting year with respect to the Linux kernel. In 2016, it was first estimated that the Linux kernel is now running on more than 50% of devices. So this is all devices. This is phones, laptops, workstations, TVs, washing machines, fridges, whatever one other weird and wonderful device runs some kind of computer. So that means you could take any one of those devices at random, and it's more likely to have Linux on it than not. And some studies were done about Linux in 2016 to find out how much it might cost to rewrite the Linux kernel from scratch if it didn't exist. Does anyone want to take a guess at the kind of figure that those studies came up with? So I heard millions. Any advance on that? Anyone think it's billions? 10 million? 10 billion? Right. We're in the right ballpark, right? It's billions. It is billions. They all disagreed wildly, but they had one thing in common. They all had the word billion in them, right? So it's more than 1 billion somewhere. Now, the thing is, a billion of anything is difficult to imagine. $1 billion is just as difficult to imagine. I don't know. You can think about it in terms of how many developers would that buy you for 10 years? You know, it's tens of thousands of developer years. Tens of thousands of developer years. It is a mind-boggling amount of effort. And all that effort has actually gone into the Linux kernel. How? Via open source. Right? Open source has made this happen. In 2016, Microsoft kept that kind of train going. They said, right, SQL Server, that's going to run on Linux now. They bought Xamarin and then open sourced it. Right? Xamarin was not open source before Microsoft bought it. They bought the company and just made it open source. They had the most contributors on GitHub for the first time. So they were the organization with the most contributors on GitHub. What's the next natural step from that? Buy GitHub. Right? And in 2018, they bought GitHub. So it's been amazing. And now the .NET framework, of course, is dead. Or is it? And it's not really. I just put that in there to see if you're still awake. But the .NET framework is not really dead. But then the .NET framework, it's interesting now when we look at the relationship of the .NET framework to .NET Core. Now, when you start a new project in Visual Studio now, do you start it in .NET Core or .NET Framework? .NET Core? I'm hearing more Core than Framework. I go for Core. Why wouldn't I? Cores, well, I mean, let's not talk too much about Core 1.0, the 1.x days. It was a bit of a tire fire. But .NET Core 2, it's looking pretty good. .NET Core 2.1, it's a long-term supported version. There's not much reason to reach for .NET Framework now unless you really specifically have to. The exciting stuff's happening in .NET Core. It's moving fast. It's like .NET Core's running off down the road and building in new features, and .NET Framework's kind of huffing and puffing and trying to keep up. But it hasn't got the open source legs that .NET Core has. And I think it's quite a nice illustration of what happens when one thing and its equivalent is, one thing's open source and the equivalent isn't. You know? .NET Framework's struggling to keep up now. .NET Framework 4.8 is kind of in preview now, I think, but I don't think anyone's that excited about it as they were with .NET Core 2.1. Let's take one last look at this graph. So I've gone ahead and been a bit more bold now, and I've said, well, if there are 10 million .NET developers in the world, then I'm going to say that probably most of them are running some of my code at some stage. You know, with the stuff I've done in NuGet and other projects, if you're not running some of my code fairly regularly now as a .NET developer, it's probably quite unusual. And that, again, the numbers aren't very important, but it's kind of starting to get to this kind of global ceiling of somewhere around the 10 million mark. This graph isn't very interesting because it's basically just a flat line, a massive spike and a flat line. It's more interesting if you look at it logarithmically. I apologize, I'm a mathematician, I did maths at university. A logarithmic graph just means that each line is 10 times the line below it. So you can see here that back in the 80s, I'm kind of in the 10s somewhere. I get my first IT job and that jumps up into the hundreds, that kind of stays there, and then I start with open source. And then we're kind of 2 orders of magnitude up, another order of magnitude, and another, and we're kind of reaching this global maximum of 10 million developers running my code. Because most of the stuff I've done is NuGet and Fake It Easy and that kind of stuff. It's kind of development style tools. This doesn't take into account now the code that's running in line of business applications that users are using in Service Bus. Right? That's in addition to all of this stuff. And I still don't really know what this chart means, to be honest. It's just a chart of how many .NET developers or how many people are running my code. It's not to say that this code down here wasn't important. It might have been more important than all of this code. This code down here might have been written for some kind of life support machine or something. It wasn't, but it could have been. But I think it's some kind of interesting metric. Maybe it's telling us the potential of the influence that my code could have in the community, in the software community. So before I did open source, it was really limited just to within that company, a few hundred users. Now, millions of people are actually benefiting from that code which I'm contributing to the community. And it is actually very easy to contribute this stuff. And I'm going to try and show you just how easy it is right now. Now, the thing is, to contribute code now, you actually don't even have to leave your web browser. So this is Automapper, right? And it's a shame that Jimmy Bogard isn't here because I was going to shame him. But I'll still do that. This is recorded, so that's all good. Now, as you can see, we've got some very, very dodgy white space going on here. And when I see this kind of thing, I cannot let it lie, right? Check out that, and check out that. Disgraceful. So what I can do now is I can go ahead and just fix this right here. So I go scroll back up to the top, I hit this edit button. And if the internet's working, which it is, I can go down to this offending code, this complete eyesore. If I can find it again, here it is, right. So let's make sure that that is 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. That's the same, and that is already okay. All right. So I can then type a commit message. I can say, well, fixed white space, and an extended message like something like, sorry, I just had to fix this before I could go on with my talk here at NDC Sydney. And I can propose a file change. Now, if I haven't forked this repo, it'll actually fork it for me and it will create a pull request. So I can say propose file change. I'm not sure if I forked it already or not. I probably have. And now it's saying, now it's comparing the changes. So I can see the changes I've made. And I can say create pull request. And then I can say, again, create pull request. And there we are. I've just sent a PR to Automapper to fix some white space. Now, really, really trivial little change, right? But I want to stress that no change is too small. And in fact, the smaller a change is, the easier it is to review in PR. If you sent, I don't know what Jimmy's reaction is going to be to this PR, but we'll see. And if it was my project, I'd say, first of all, I'd be horrified that I'd had that bad white space in there. And then I'd say, thank you very much for fixing it, and I'd merge the PR. So let's see if Jimmy does the same. So that's pretty easy, right? I'm sure that anyone here could have done what I just did. Right? I don't think anyone thinks the opposite. So what is the future of open source? Well, again, from our different angles, I want to make more impact for open source. So through the community contributions I've done through, say, NuGet, for instance, although you're running a little bit of my code each time you install a NuGet package, you probably didn't even know that, and it's probably not having that much effect in your life. So I want to make a bit more of a deeper impact and to really help people develop better line of business applications. And that's one of the reasons that I joined Particular Software. We're the makers of NService Bus. All our products are open source, and now the code that I'm writing is being used in line of business applications in a much more meaningful way than that tiny little NuGet feature. So I really want to carry on doing that. I want Microsoft basically just keep going, just keep doing what you're doing. Right? They're doing great open source things all the time. More of the new stuff they do is open source. More of the old stuff is being released as open source. So Microsoft, you're doing well. Just keep that going. And from the community, what I want to see is more contribution. Now, very specifically, I want to see more contribution from large companies. I want to see large companies recognize that it makes sense for their employees to be contributing back to open source, to be adding that feature, to be fixing that bug on company time. It makes sense, but companies are still very slow to realize this. They're getting better, but from what I've seen, it's still tough. And sometimes some companies have actually blocked right access to GitHub. You can't even log into GitHub anymore through the corporate firewall because they're worried about code being leaked out or people doing the wrong thing with GitHub. But that just puts up such a barrier to contribution. So I want to see some of those walls being broken down. And now I want to introduce something at this stage, and that's you to the future. So, or maybe it's better for me to say us. So, we are the future of open source, and you can contribute. You can send a PR to something like I just did. As I said, I'm sure everyone could have just sent that white space PR that I just did. It's a tiny little thing, but it's getting the ball rolling. It's getting you started. Once you've sent one PR, you sent a slightly big one. In the end, you might end up becoming a maintainer of something as that snowballs. Answer a call. Put your hand up and say, yep, sure, I'll help out, or I'll take it on when someone asks for help. Throw it out there. You might have that little project, side project. You might think, well, this would be quite good as open source, but it's not ready. Well, software's never ready, right? Software is something that evolves. And to be honest, if you put it out there as open source now, no one's really going to notice anyway. But it has the option of someone coming in, finding it useful, and contributing back. So my advice is put it out there, make it open source early. Give people the chance to get involved. So we've got a little bit of time left, but I guess you probably won't complain if we finish slightly early. But has anyone got any questions now before I wrap up? Yeah.
How did you balance time spent delivering value at work versus contributing to open source?
Okay, so how do I balance time spent contributing open source with my time at work? So it's a good question, and I probably don't have a really great answer. I guess this is one of the reasons that I want companies to recognize this more, right? Because that's a challenge, and I found it a challenge. And there were times where, and you've probably heard this from other open source maintainers. Did any of you go to the talk by Jeffrey Huntley and where they talked about this, where they talked about things like burnout and stuff like that? And yes, I felt that pressure before, and it's tough when you're trying to balance a full-time job and you're doing it as your hobby. I want to see that not having to just be your hobby, because it makes sense for you to be doing this stuff on company time. I remember I used to think, well, we need a fix to this. I'm going to go home and do that tonight on my own time, and I'm going to come in tomorrow, and hopefully it's going to get merged. And some project would merge and release really quickly, and hopefully then we can use it at work tomorrow, which is ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. That should be done on company time. So I think that's a challenge, and I think that's where we need to be looking for the solution for that. You had another question?
No, I was the same question.
Okay.
What's the motivation for you? Which kind of like somewhat you explained in the presentation. Maybe if you want to, what motivates you?
So where does my motivation come from? Yeah, I think it's a good question as well. There are a number of different facets to that. One of them is just that there was things that I needed at work, and I thought, well, this may as well be an open source project. So that's another thing. We do end up writing some level of infrastructure code at work for our stuff. It's not just pure business rules. And more often than not, that stuff would be better as an open source project, because if it's not business specific, it's likely to be useful at another business as well. And part of my motivation for doing open source was exactly that. I thought to myself, well, why am I writing this for this job when this is actually something that I solved in my last job as well, and in my next job I'm probably going to have to solve again. So I would make that an open source project instead, in order to get that reuse. And I think that was part of it. And maybe there's also like an altruistic aspect that I want to help out. I just want to help. Part of it sometimes is to gain some recognition. I'm not going to lie, it was great to be invited to speak at conferences as a result of being involved in open source, and that just reinforced my motivation. Say, well, this and I got a Microsoft MVP award out of it as well. So things like that, the recognition aspect does feed back into it as well, I think. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. So So it's kind of multifaceted. It's a bit of a hand wavy answer, but I hope it's hope it's useful.
The
Yeah.
first point was good as well, and recognition, I'm not sure how rewarding it is, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. I found it. I've generally found it very rewarding, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this talk. Okay, so I'll wrap up, and I'll just say that that is one of the reasons I wanted to do this talk, and the other reason was that you may have noticed a bit of a gap between 2008, when I first used OSS, and 2012, when I first contributed. And I think if I'd have heard a talk a little bit like this back in that time frame, that may have happened a bit more quickly. So, I've showed you a number of ways to contribute. I think it's good to bear in mind what kind of open source project you're interacting with. Is it one that's funded by Microsoft, or is it something that people are doing in their spare time, or is it, there's a wide spectrum of different open source projects out there. But back in 2012, I was just a guy that put his project online. Back in the same time frame, I was just a guy that put up his hand when someone asked for help with Fake It Easy. And with Connect, I was just a person in the audience that saw an easy test to fix and just fixed it and sent a PR. And I'm sure that I could have replaced myself with any one of you listening today, and things would have worked out in the same way. I don't think I did anything special. So I hope that's motivating you to somehow get a little bit involved, if you aren't already, of course. I understand that many of you here may already be quite involved in open source, and if you are, that's a really good thing. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed talking to you. You've had a great conference, and so have I. Is anyone going to PubConf? Yeah, okay, great. I'll see you there. All right. Thank you very much.